Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Rheumatology in Review. I'm Sam Good, and this is the good stuff. Today, we're going to be talking about a new JAK inhibitor for ankylosing spondylitis. Today's article is titled Efficacy and Safety of Ivarmacitinib, a selective JAK1 inhibitor in patients with active ankylosing spondylitis, results from an adaptive seamless phase 2-3 trial. It was published in June of this year in Arthritis and Rheumatology. Ivarmacitinib is a selective JAK1 inhibitor with much more affinity for JAK1 than it has for JAK2, and even more so compared to JAK3 and TYK2. This is a randomized controlled trial. It is a combination of a phase 2 and phase 3 study. I'm going to be talking mostly about the phase 3 study because the phase 2 study kind of leads right into the phase 3 study. And I think for clinical practice, the phase 3 study is where we can draw a lot of our conclusions, especially when it comes to comparing the actual drug itself to placebo. For the phase 3 study, patients were randomized to receive ivormeacitanib at 4 milligrams or placebo. The primary endpoint was ACES-20 response, and this was at week 12. There's also a follow-up 24-week period of the study, which we will also discuss. You can see that for the primary endpoint up here, the ACES-20 response, in placebo, 54 people met the response, the primary endpoint, and in the treatment group, 91 patients met the response. The difference versus placebo was 19.6, and it was highly statistically significant, showing that the drug ivarmacitinib met its primary endpoint. It also met many of the secondary endpoints. I've included some of them here. There's more. There's a lot of patient-reported outcome measures in a kind of follow-up portion of this table. But as far as these other study responses, like the ACES-40, as you might expect, this is more of a stringent response, so less people met the primary endpoint, but that was true in both groups, and the difference versus placebo was 13.8, still statistically significant. These are other outcome measures. The ACES-5-6, also statistically significant. And then BASDAI and BASFI scores actually decreased more in the treatment group as compared to the placebo group. Again, both of which were statistically significant. So you can see that this medication seems to be effective for the treatment of active ankylosing spondylitis. This is a graph of what the outcome looks like, and then it includes the 24-week extension period. You can see that for the primary endpoint at week 12, the treatment group, which is the blue line as opposed to the gray line in the first portion of the graph, had a greater response rate. And you can also see that responses really occurred pretty quickly. So even by week 2, it looks like about 20% of patients met the ACES-20 response. And then in the extension period, where everybody received the treatment, so that's this orange line here, the placebo patients then start taking the treatment and the treatment group continues. By week 24, the placebo group had caught up, or at this point it wasn't a placebo group anymore, but the group that had initially not received the drug caught up, and they caught up pretty quickly. It looks like even by week 16, there's a lot of overlap between those two error bars. This is looking at the ACES-40, and you can see, again, very similar results. By week 12, it looks like the treatment group, which is in blue, has a greater response compared to the placebo group in gray. But then in the 24-week extension period, once the placebo group started receiving the drug, they caught up pretty quickly. Again, by week 16, they'd essentially already caught up. And by week 24, they had similar outcomes. A really interesting finding in the study is in the supplementary material, and it's their pre-specified subgroup analyses. It's really important to note that patients who had not received prior DMARDs or a prior JAK inhibitor, they improved on the treatment drug compared to placebo, statistically significantly so. But then also patients who had received prior DMARDs and JAK inhibitors had an improvement on this therapy. The difference versus placebo, this is at 12 weeks, this table's all for 12 weeks, was 18.6. And then again, this was statistically significant. So the drug appears to work also for patients who had received prior therapies. Finally, here's a table of their adverse events during the trial. And overall, the adverse events of interest really did not differ a whole lot between the two groups. So serious infection, in the 12-week period, there was 1 in the placebo group and none in the treatment group. And then for the 24-week period, none overall. The only things that were higher in the treatment group were any systemic opportunistic infection, there was one, and then a LFT abnormality, there was one. But there were no major cardiovascular events, thromboembolic events, or newly diagnosed cancers. And then overall, the amount of adverse events between the two groups was higher in the treatment group for sure, but of these more concerning events, not a huge difference between the groups. I think a lot of this is driven by the fact that this is a 24-week study and not a 52-week study. And really for the placebo-controlled period, it's just a 12-week study. So that's where they're really comparing adverse events. It's at 12 weeks. So the idea that somebody would have, an MI or a new cancer diagnosis in a 12-week period, pretty slim overall. But these adverse events are pretty similar between the two groups. Overall, this study provides supporting evidence for the use of this novel JAK inhibitor for active ankylosing spondylitis. There are a few limitations to this study, one of which is that it's short. It's 12 weeks, which is not a particularly long time to observe things like adverse events. As of the time of this recording, as far as I could tell, the FDA has not approved this therapy yet, but it's an exciting development in the field nonetheless.